Persuasion by Jane Austen. Chapter 6. Anne had not wanted this visit to Uppercross to learn that the removal from one set of people to another, though a distance of only 3 miles, would often conclude a total change of conversation, opinion, and idea. She had never staying there before, and without being struck by it, or wishing that the Elliots could have advantage of seeing how unknown or unconsidered there where the affairs at Kellynch Hall were treated as such general publicity of pervading interest. Yet, with all this experience, she believed that she must now submit to feel that another lesson in the art of knowing that nothingness beyond our own circle was become necessary for her, and for certainly, as coming as she did, with full heart of the subject, and had been completely occupying both houses in Kellynch for many weeks. She had expected rather more curiosity and sympathy, so that she found in a separate but very similar remark of Mr. and Mrs. Mungrove. "So, Anne, Sir Walter and your sister are gone, and what part of Bath do you think they will settle in?" And this, without much waiting for an answer, or in the young lady's addition of, "I hope we shall be in Bath in the winter. Remember, papa, if we do go, we must be in a good situation. None of your Queen Squares for us. Or in an ancient supplement of Mary, or upon my word, I shall be pretty well off, and you are all gone away and happy at Bath." He could only resolve to avoid such a self-delusion in the future, and to think a heightened gratitude of the extraordinary blessing of having one truly sympathizing friend as Lady Russell. The Mr. Mungroves had their own name to guard and to destroy, their own horses, dogs, and newspapers to engage them. Females were fully occupied in all other subjects of housekeeping, neighbours, dress, dancing, and music. She had acknowledged it to be very fitting that the little social commonwealth should dictate its own matters of discourse, and hope, ere long, not to become note of an unworthy member of the one she was transplanted into. With the prospect of spending at least 2 months at Uppercross, it was highly incumbent on to clothe her imagination, her memory, and all their ideas as much of Uppercross as possible. She had no dread of these 2 months. Mary was not so repulsive and unsisterly as Elizabeth, or no so inaccessible to all influence of hers. Neither was there anything among the other component parts of the cottage inimical to comfort. She was always on friendly terms with her brother-in-law, and the children, who loved her nearly as well, and respected her a great deal more than her mother. She had an object of her interest, amusement, and wholesome exertion. Charles Mungrove was civil and agreeable. In the sense of his temper he was undoubtedly superior to his wife, but not of powers, or conversation, or grace to make the past, as they were connected together, at all the dangerous complication. Although at the same time Anne could believe, with Lady Russell, that was a more equal match, might have greatly improved him, and a woman of real understanding might have given consequently to his character, and the more usefulness in rationality and elegance of his habits and pursuits. As it was, he did nothing with much zeal, but sport, and at the times otherwise it was chipped away, without benefit of books or anything else. He had very good spirits, which never seemed to affect much as a wife's occasional lowness, born to her unreasonable sometimes to Anne's admiration, and upon the whole, though there was often little disagreement in which she had sometimes more than she wished, and being appealed to by both parties, they might pass for a happy couple. They were always perfectly agreed in the want of more money, and a strong inclination for a handsome present for his father. But there, as on most topics, he had superiority. For while Mary, though it was a great shame that such a present was not made, he always contended for a father having many other uses for money, and to spend it as he liked. As to the management of their children, his theory was much better than his wife's, and his practice was not so bad. I could manage them very well, if it was not for Mary's interference, which was what Anne often heard him say, and he had a good deal in faith in. But when listening in turn to Mary's reproach of Charles spoil his children so that I cannot get them into any order, she has never the smallest temptation to say, "Very true." One of the least agreeable circumstances of her residence was her being treated too much confidence by all parties, and being too much in the secret of the complaints of each house known to have some influence with her sister. She was continually requested, or at least receiving hints to exert it, beyond what was practicable. "I wish you persuade Mary not to always fancying herself ill," was Charles's language, and in an unhappy mood thus spoke Mary. I do believe if Charles was to see me dying, he would not think there was anything matter with me, I am sure, and if you would, you might persuade him that I am really am very well, and a great deal worse than I ever own. Mary's declaration was, I hate sending the children to the great house, though their grandmamma is always wanting to see them, for she humours and indulges them to such a degree that gives them so much trash and sweet things that they are sure to come back sick and cross for the rest of the day. And Mrs. Bungroves took the opportunity to be alone with Anne to say, "Oh, Miss Anne, I cannot help wishing Mr. Charles had a little of your method with those children. They are quite different creatures from you, but to be sure, in general they are so spoiled. It is a pity you cannot put your sister in a way of managing them, as they are fine hearted children as were seen, poor little dears, without partiality. But Mr. Charles knows no more how they should be treated. Bless me, how troublesome they are sometimes. I assure you, Miss Anne, to prevent my wishing to see them at our house so often as I otherwise should. But I believe Mr. Charles was not quite pleased with not my not inviting them oftener. But if you know it is very bad to have children that one is obligated to be checking every moment, don't do this, don't do that, or that one who can keep in tolerable order by more than cake than is good for them. She had this communication, moreover, from Mary. Mrs. Mungrove thinks that all her servants are so steady, and that would be high treason to call in question, but I am sure, without exaggeration, that her upper house maid and laundry maid, instead of being in her business, are gadding about the village all day long, and I meet them whenever I go. I declare, I must go twice in my nursery without seeing some of them. If Jemima was not the trustiest, steadiest creature in the world, it would be enough to spoil her, and she tells me that they are tempting to her to take a walk with them, and on Miss Mungrove's side it already was. I made a rule of never interfering with them any daughter-in-law is concerned, for I would not make it do, and I should tell you, Miss Anne, because you may be able to set things right, that I have no very good opinion of Charles' nursery maid. I have heard strange stories of her, always upon the God, and from my own knowledge I can declare she is such a fine dressing lady, and she is enough to ruin any servant she comes near. Mrs. Charles quite swears by her, and I know that, but I just give you this hint, that you may be upon the watch, because if you see anything amiss, do not be afraid to mention it. Again, this is Mary's complaint, that Mrs. Mungrove was very apt not to give her the precedence that was due, and when they dined at the great house with other families, she did not see any reason why she was to be considered so much at home as to lose her place. And one day, when Anne was walking only with the Mungroves, after talking of rank, people of rank, and jealousy of rank, and said, I've no scruple of observing you, how nonsensical some persons are about their place, but all the world knows how easy it is and indifferent you are about it. But I wish anybody could give Mary a hint that it would be a great deal better if she was not so tenacious, especially if she were not always putting herself toward to take the place of mamma. Nobody doubts her right to have precedence of mamma, but it would be more becoming in her not to always be insisting on it. It's not that mamma cares about it in the least in the world, but I know it is already taken by many persons. How was Aunt to set all these matters to right? She could do a little more by listening patiently, softening every grievance, and excusing each other, and giving them hints of forbearance necessary between such near neighbors, and make those hints the broadest when they were meant for a sister's benefit. In all other respects, her visit began to proceed very well, and her own spirits improved by the change of place and subject, being removed 3 miles from Kellynch, and Mary's ailments lessened from having constant companion, and her daily intercourse with the other families, since there were neither superior affection, confidence, nor employment in the cottage to be interrupted by it, was rather advantage. And certainly carried nearly as far as possible, for they met in the morning, and not ever spent a night asunder, and believed that they should not have done so well without the sight of Mr. and Mrs. Mungrove's respectable forms in the usual place, or without their talking, laughing, and singing of their daughters. She played a great deal better than either of the Miss Mungroves, and having no voice, no knowledge of the harp, and no fond parents to sit by and fancy themselves delighted, her performance was a little thought of, only out of civility, or to refresh the others, and as she was well aware that She knew that when she played, she was giving pleasure only to herself, and this was no new sensation, excepting for one short period of her life. She had never, since the age of 14, never since the loss of her dear mother, known the happiness of being listened to, or encouraged by any appreciation or real taste. In music, she had always been used to feeling alone in the world, and Mr. and Mrs. Mungroves found partially for their own daughter's performance, and total indifference to any other person's, they were much more pleasure for their sakes than mortification for her own. The party at the great house was sometimes increased by other company. Neighborhood was not large, but the Mungroves were visited by everybody, and more parties, more callers, more visitors by invitation and by chance, and every other family were they were more completely popular. The girls were wild for dancing, and all the evenings ended occasionally in the unpremeditated little ball. There was a family of cousins within a walk of Uppercross in less affluent circumstances who depended on the Mungroves for all their pleasures. They would come at any time, help play at anything, or dance anywhere. And Anne, very much preferring the office of a musician for a more active post, played country dances to them by the hour together, and kindness they always recommended their musical powers to the notice of Mr. and Mrs. Mungroves more than anything else, and often drew this compliment, "Well done, Miss Anne, very well indeed. Lord bless me, how those little fingers of yours fly about." And so passed, and in the first 3 weeks Michaelmas came, and Anne's heart must be in Kellynch again, and a beloved home to make over to others in all the precious other rooms and furniture, grows and prospects, in the beginning of others' eyes and other limbs. She could not think much else on the 29th of September, and this had sympathetic touch in the evening of Mary, who, on having occasion to note the day of the month, exclaimed, "Dear me! Is this not the day that the cross were to come down on Kellynch? I am glad I did not think of it before. How low it makes me!" The Crofts took possession with a true naval alertness, and were to be visited. Mary deplored the necessity of herself, nobody knew how might she suffer, and she should put it off as long as she could, and it was not easy till she had talked Charles into driving her on the early day, and was very animated. Comfortable state of imaginary agitation, and when she came back, Anne had very sincerely rejoiced in their being no means ever going. She wished, however, to see the cross, which was glad to begin within the visit of returned. And they came. The masters of the house were not to be home, but the two sisters were together, as of chance by Mrs. Croft to feel the share of Anne, while the Admiral sat by Mary and made itself very agreeable by his good-humoured notice of his little boys. And she was well able to watch a likeness, and, if it failed her in the features, to catch it for a voice, or turn of sentiment and expression. Mrs. Croft, neither tall nor fat, had a squareness, uprightness, and vigour of form, which gave importance to her person. She had bright dark eyes, good teeth, and altogether an agreeable face, though her reddened, weather-beaten complexion, and a consequence of having almost as much tea as her husband, made her seem to have lived some years longer than her world of 80, than her real 8 and 30. Her manners were open, easy, and decided, like those who had no distrust of herself, and no doubts of what to do, without any approach to coarseness, however, in any want of good humour, Anne gave her credit, and indeed, for the feelings of great consideration towards herself, and related that to Kellynch it pleases her, and especially satisfied himself in the very first half minute. In the instance of even introduction, there was not even the small symptoms of any knowledge or suspicion on Mrs. Cruft's side, to be the bias of any sort. She was quite easily on that head, and consequently full of strength and courage, till a moment electrified by Mrs. Croft suddenly saying, "It was you, and not your sister, I find out my brother had the pleasure of being acquainted with when he was in this country." Anne had hoped she outlived the age of blushing, but the age of emotion had certainly not. "And perhaps you may not have heard that he is married?" added Mrs. Croft, and she could now answer as she thought, and she was happy to feel when Mrs. Croft's next word explained it to be Mr. Wentworth, of whom she spoke, and she had nothing much not to do for either brother, and she immediately found how reasonable it was that Mrs. Croft should be thinking and speaking of Edward, and not of Frederick, and with the shame of her own forgetfulness applied to herself in the knowledge of her former neighbour's present state was proper interest, and the rest of all tranquillity, until just they were moving, she heard the Admiral say to Mary, "We are expecting a brother of Mrs. Croft's here soon. I dare say you know him by his name." He was cut short by the eager attacks of little boys, and clinging to him like an old friend, and declaring that he should not go, and too much engrossed by the proposals of carrying them away in his coat pockets, and see, to have another moment for finishing and recollecting what he had just begun. And Anne was left to persuade herself as much as she could that the same brother still being the exact question, and she could not, however, reach such a degree of certainty not to be anxious to hear when anything had been said on the subject at the other house, where the Crofts had previously been calling. The folks of Great House were to spend the evening of this day at the cottage, and it spent too late of the year and to make such visits on foot, and the coach was beginning to be listened for when the youngest Miss Mungroves walked in, and she was coming to apologize, and they had ready to spend the evening by themselves, was the first black idea. Mary was quite ready to be affronted, and Louisa made all right by saying she only came on foot, and more room for the harp, which was bringing in the carriage. "I will tell you our reason," she added, "and all about it. I'm come on to give you notice that Papa and Mamma are out of spirits this evening, especially Mamma. She is thinking so much of poor Richard, and we agreed to it that it would best to have the harp, for it seemed to amuse her more than the pianoforte. I will tell you why she is out of spirits. When the Crofts were calling this morning, they called here afterwards, did they not? And perhaps to say that her brother, Captain Wentworth, is just returned to England, and paid off, or something, that is coming to see them almost directly, and most unluckily it came to my mamma's head, and when they were gone, that Wentworth, or something very much like it was the name of poor Richard and the captain at one time. I do not know when or where, but great while after he was dead, poor fellow. In looking over his letters and things, he found it was so, and perfectly sure that it must be said that this very man in her head is quite full of it, of poor Richard, and must be merry as we can, and that she may be not dwelling in on such gloomy things. The real circumstances of this pathetic piece of family history were that the Mungroves had an ill fortune, a very troublesome and hopeless son, and the good fortune to lose him when he reached his 20th year, and had been sent to sea because he was stupid and unmanageable on shore, and when he very little cared for any time by his family, and though quite as much as he deserved, until them heard of, for scarcely all related, and the intelligence of his death abroad had worked its way to Uppercross 2 years before. He had, in fact, though his sisters were not doing all they could for him in calling him poor Richard, had nothing better than a thick-headed, unfeeling, unprofitable Dick Musgrove, who had never done anything to entitle himself, and more to the abbreviation of his name, living or dead. He had been several years at sea, and had, in the course of those removals of which all the midshipmen men are liable, and especially on such midshipmen men as every captain wishes to get rid of, and 6 months on board Captain Frederick Wentworth's frigate in the Laconia, or from the Laconia he had, under the influence of the captain, who has written only 2 letters which his father and mother had received from him during his whole of his absence, that is to say, only 2 disinterested letters, and all the rest had been mere applications for money. In the letter he had spoken well of his captain, but yet they were so little in the habit of attending such matters, so unobservant and incurious as they were to names of the ships, and made scarcely any impression at the time, and made Mrs. Mungroves, who had been suddenly struck this very day with the recollection of the names in Wentworth as connected as their son, seemed one of those extraordinary bursts of mind which do sometimes occur. She had gone on her letters, and found it all as she had supposed, and the reprisal of these letters after so long an interval of her poor son gone forever, and all the strength of his faults forgotten, and her affected her spirits exceedingly, throwing her into greater grief for him than she had known on the first hearing of his death. Mr. Mungrove was as, at a lesser degree, affected likewise, and when they reached the cottage, they were evidently in want of first of being listened to anew on the subject, and afterwards, after all the relief of which their cheerful companions could give them. To hear them talking so much about Captain Wentworth, repeating his name so often, so puzzling after the years, at last asserting that it might, and probably would, turn out to be the very same Captain Wentworth as one they could recollected at the meeting. One choice after coming back from Clifton, a very fine young man, but they could not say if it was 7 or 8 years ago, a new sort of trial to Aunt's nerves. She found, however, it must be that one she must inure herself, and he actually was expecting in the country. She must teach herself to be insensible on such points. And not only did it appear that he was expected, and speedily, but the Mungroves, in their warm gratitude for kindness that he had shewn poor Dick, had high respect for his character, and was stamped as it by poor Dick's having been 6 months under her care, and mentioning him strong, but no perfectly well phrased, as fine as dashing fellow, only too particular about the schoolmaster. They were bent on introducing themselves, and seeking his acquaintance. They could soon hear of his arrival. The resolution of doing so helped to form the comfort of their evening.